everyone. Shirley here. It is an understatement to say that there are a lot of changes happening in the federal marketplace, and there are more to come. How can small businesses grasp exactly what those changes are and will be? And how do they prepare to compete and win contracts under new rules and or revised rules? That's what we're talking about today. What do we know now at the time of this recording? What changes are we anticipating based upon recent executive orders? How are small business set-aside programs changing? What other regulations do we anticipate being eliminated? And most importantly, how can small businesses continue to play an important role in helping the federal government achieve its missions and serve the American people? My special guest today to help us understand these important and evolving matters is Stephen Koprince, educator, speaker, and author whose mission is to help explain federal government contracting principles and rules in plain English. My name is Shirley Collier. I'm a serial entrepreneur and founder and CEO of Skeleton Market, whose mission is to help small GovCons think, plan, and execute the business strategies that will allow their companies to grow in the very complex government marketplace. Welcome, Steve.
Well, thank you. It's Shirley. I appreciate you having me here today. It's really a pleasure.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you. I only briefly introduced you, Steve. Please tell our audience a little more about yourself.
Well, fantastic. My favorite topic now. Thank you again, Shirley, for having me. It really is a pleasure to join you for this discussion. I come here as a former attorney. I practiced law for about 16 or almost 17 years. And in that field, I focus exclusively on U.S. federal government contractors and subcontractors, with most of my clients being small businesses. And so I founded a law firm called Koprince McCall Potroff, LLC. That's what's called a boutique law firm, meaning that it focuses exclusively on a specific area of law, and ours was U.S. federal government contracts and subcontracts. I'm no longer practicing law. A couple of years ago, I decided I'd kind of had enough of that, at least for the time being. Had the opportunity to transfer my interest to my partners, who are wonderful people and are still doing a wonderful job running that firm. And so now I'm focused more on the education side and the training side for small businesses and federal contracting, and other small businesses as well. I train contractors through an organization called Gavology. I work with Apex Accelerators. I do a little bit of consulting, and I sit on the board of directors of a government contractor as well. And so I'm involved in federal contracting, wearing a variety of hats. That said, before we get started, I do want to note that today I'm appearing on my own behalf, just as not on behalf of the firm I founded, which I'm no longer part of, or on behalf of any of my current employers or anyone who's working with me as an independent contractor.
Awesome. Thank you, Steve. I want to tee up our conversation with a very brief summary of how we got here. During the presidential campaign, candidate Trump promised to reduce the size of federal government and to drastically cut regulations. His second term has been marked by a robust and aggressive, to say the least, push to dismantle federal regulations across multiple sectors. Now, legal experts argue that the administration's actions may violate existing laws and are being challenged in court. So this conversation is based upon what we know today. Among the regulations being reviewed are the federal acquisition regulations and the SBA's set-aside programs, which are most germane to our audience today. I want to stipulate that this is not a political discussion. Regardless of your political views, it is good business to understand the rules, preference, decision-making criteria, and competition in the market that we intend to serve. So, Steve, let's begin our discussion with the SBA's set-aside programs. The SBA offers 4 major socioeconomic certification programs, as you know. It's the 8A, STVOSB, VOSB, Veterans, HUBZone, and Women-Owned Small Business and Economically Disadvantaged, WOSB. How do you expect that these programs will be treated in the new administration?
That's a great place to start. Small businesses are near and dear to my heart, small government contractors. That's the large majority of my client base that I worked with as an attorney were small businesses, and it always gave me a lot of happy feelings to be able to help those companies understand the federal marketplace, especially when there are changes happening right now we've got those four major socioeconomic set-aside programs. Let's start with those. As you mentioned, the 8A program, service-disabled, veteran-owned small business, and also has the component of veteran-owned small business, which doesn't have as much in the way of preferences outside the VA. Your HUBZone program and your woman-owned small business program with a subset of economically disadvantaged woman-owned small business program. And all four of these major socioeconomic programs are statutorily created. That means that Congress created those programs and said SBA and FAR Council to a lesser degree, you operate these programs, develop regulations in certain cases regarding those programs. What does that mean? Well, it means that the administration doesn't have legal authority to unilaterally eliminate or make changes to those programs outside of what the statute. I do think it's important that contractors don't treat these programs like they're all the same. So these are four different programs serving four different constituencies, but they're created to do different things and to serve different constituencies. That means that they may have different levels of support, both within the administration itself and its congressional allies. And I would specifically point to the SDVSB program, the Service Disabled Veteran-Owned Small Business Program, as one that I think is not going to go anywhere under this administration and its congressional allies. On the other hand, there was a bill introduced in the last session of Congress that has not yet been reintroduced as we're having this conversation by allies of the current administration that would have essentially eliminated the 8A program. And again, that bill has not yet been reintroduced, and it died in committee in the last Congress. Didn't even get to the point where it was going to come up for a floor vote. But it did characterize the 8A program essentially as DEI. And that's what that bill said. We want to get rid of these programs because we think that it's a form of DEI. There was a court decision almost 2 years ago now called Ultima, a federal court decision, in which a federal judge said that provision, the one that really looked like DEI to some folks, was held to be unconstitutional and unenforceable. There was a nationwide injunction issued, and the SBA decided not to fight it. So they haven't even been enforcing that provision. So I'm hopeful that with a little more education potentially about what the 8A program looks like now, and the fact that this component that allowed a leg up for members of certain racial and ethnic groups is no longer being enforced, hasn't for almost 2 years, there'll be less of an incentive for anybody in Congress to try to push for the elimination or major overhaul of that program.
So, given that Congress could take action to change these programs, what advice do you have for companies that are 8A, WOSB, or HUBZone certified to help ensure that those programs remain intact?
Because these programs are statutory, it means that members of Congress are key here. There's nothing wrong with reaching out to your members of Congress. In fact, it'd probably be a good idea to do this. You can also consider joining industry groups and associations for companies like yours. All of these major four certifications that we've talked about have industry groups of companies that hold that certification.
I agree, Steve. And we're going to be sending out a follow-up email with links to help companies identify their elected officials and industry groups that are lobbying for small businesses. Let's now turn to another important small business topic, and that is goaling. There's been a lot of talk in the government contracting community regarding small business goals and what the Trump administration has done to alter those goals. What can you tell us?
Yeah, fantastic. And by the way, that resource you're going to send out with the email sounds very useful. So yeah, the goaling is another area in which there has been some confusion and misinformation. But one of the things that I've heard is that the administration has already or is about to eliminate the various small business goals, and that is incorrect. The government every year has government-wide goals for an amount of prime contracting dollars that it would like to see awarded to small businesses in the aggregate, as well as separate goals for small disadvantaged businesses, which includes 8A, but also self-certified SDVs, HUBZone companies, SDVOSBs, and the women-owned small businesses, which also include the subset of the EDWSBs. And so every year the government sets these goals, working with the SBA, and then the different agencies have their own individualized goals, but these are the government-wide goals that the government is trying to achieve year in and year out. And so one thing that I've heard is, well, this administration has wiped those out. That is incorrect, and the reason is because, well, first of all, I can't say that they want to, so let's put that out there. But even if they did, they're statutory. The following goals are set in the U.S. Code. Small business goal of 23%, at least 23%. Service-disabled veteran-owned small business goal of at least 5%. Small disadvantaged business goal of at least 5%. Woman-owned small business goal of at least 5%. And HUD zone goal of at least 3%. And again, those percentages are based on percentage of total prime contracting dollars, or at least what the SBA calls eligible dollars. There's some dollars that aren't included in that total, but the vast majority of contracting dollars are. So far, I have not seen any suggestion that the administration or its allies in Congress are pushing to amend any or all of these goals. What the SBA said once President Trump issued the executive order to put the goal back at 5% for SDB was essentially, okay, we're at 5% now. We're back to the floor, and the SBA said, here's where all the goals are for 2025, and it's just the numbers I listed, those statutory floors.
Thank you for that clarification, Steve. I want to emphasize that the statutory goals are floors, not ceilings. Agencies are allowed to exceed those goals, though I think under the current administration, I would not anticipate that contracting officers would be encouraged to do so, unlike in previous administrations. However, on the good news side of things, discretionary spending in the current fiscal year, 2025, approved just a couple of weeks ago, is $750 billion. And if only $650 billion is spent, the president has vowed, of course, not to spend all of what Congress has appropriated. And $650 billion was what it was in 2019. 23% of that figure, $650 billion, is $149 billion. It is still a very large market for small businesses. And 5% is $32 billion that would be allocated to small disadvantaged businesses. So I'm advising my clients not to hunker down, but to double down on their business development efforts to position themselves for current year and FY26 through 29 spending. So, Steve, let's now talk about the Trump administration's overhaul of the FAR, which some are calling FAR 2.0. What can you tell us at a big picture level about this initiative? What is the timeline, and what can the government contracting community expect?
Fantastic question. This is what's on the minds of, I think, everybody in contracting these days. A lot of changes going on, but this is probably the biggest one. I do want to just quickly go back to the goals and say I think your advice is spot on, Shirley, that we've got these, what I think are going to be very big numbers in terms of the spend for small businesses coming up under this administration. And I would point out that in recent years, under administrations of both parties, the government has exceeded the 23% small business goal and it's exceeded the 5% SDB goal. Can't say for sure that's going to happen again, but that's been the trend, even without previous administration increasing those goals or anything like that. So I think your advice there is absolutely spot on for your clients. But let's get back to this FAR 2.0. This is a really big deal. We're talking about what's probably going to be the biggest change in government procurement regulations since at least the 1990s, maybe going back to the adoption of the FAR, which we're talking about the early 80s. We're talking a long time since we've probably seen an initiative this big. And it's, at least at this point, scheduled to happen quickly, which if you are familiar with the FAR Council, may come as a bit of a shock because the FAR Council ordinarily is not known for working that quickly. You can see, I've seen them take 5 years from when Congress said write this provision to when it actually showed up in the FAR. Under the executive order, that's not what's supposed to happen. So what happened is that on April 15th, President Trump issued an executive order calling for a rewrite of the FAR. And in that executive order, the president imposed a 180-day timeline to at least have the draft of what we're calling now FAR 2.0. And that means we're looking at mid-October. Now, that deadline could be pushed. It wouldn't be the first time that a regulatory deadline got pushed. But assuming that we stick to that, we've got an administration right now that is shown that is willing to work quickly to accomplish its goal, that we're talking this fall when we may see at least an initial look at this FAR 2.0. What will FAR 2.0 do? What will it change? Well, what the executive order says is that The FAR is only to maintain those items required by statute and those deemed necessary for good procurement practice. Regulators who are looking at these regulations are now told, keep all the stuff that Congress mandated specifically, but if it comes through an executive order, or if it comes through just FAR Council on its own volition, decided to do this to implement a specific policy perspective, we're going to assume sort of that we're getting rid of that stuff, unless it's quote unquote, deemed necessary for good procurement practice.
And you're right, it is a big deal and one that many of us are monitoring. Let's explore this a little bit more. You've written about the small business rule of two that could be affected or even eliminated by FAR 2.0. As a refresher, what is the rule of two and why is it important for small businesses? And why might it be impacted by FAR 2.0?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I'm following closely. The first thing that I thought of when I saw the directive in the executive order was the rule of two for small businesses could be affected by the requirement to only maintain items that are required by statute, and the presumption that those not required by statute maybe would leave the FAR either immediately or within 4 years. So let's step back a second. What is the rule of two? I'm sure some of you are familiar with it, some perhaps less so. What the rule of two is the tool that requires small business set-asides. The FAR regulation is codified in FAR 19.5022, if you want to look it up. But what it is it's the government's primary mechanism for awarding small business contracts. What the rule of two says is that when certain conditions are met, and what generally that means is when the government, based on its market research, has a reasonable expectation that for whatever acquisition it is going to compete, that it will receive two or more offers from qualified, capable small businesses that will be competitive in terms of price and other characteristics, that it needs to issue that solicitation as a small business set-aside. Between the simplified acquisition threshold, which is currently at $250,000 for most acquisitions, and the micro purchase threshold, which is around $10,000 for most acquisitions, the rule of two is statutory. Having that rule of two above the simplified acquisition threshold is a centerpiece of the government's ability to meet and exceed that 23% goal we talked about, and those other goals we talked about too for the SDBs and the SDVSBs and hub zones. But especially for the 23%, and for a number of years now in a row, the government has exceeded that. I think last year was around 28% or something like that. So it's the primary vehicle driving those numbers, driving those billions of dollars that are being awarded to small businesses. But it's not statutory above the simplified acquisition threshold. It's now in the hands of the folks writing this FAR 2.0 to decide what they do with that, because you've got this broad congressional policy but no congressional command that rule exists. It's still an ongoing concern. It's something that maybe we won't know the answer to until October or whenever the draft comes out, but it's going to be a big deal for the small business community if this rule changes or goes away.
So given that it is a big deal to the small business community, what can small businesses do to encourage the government to keep the current rule of two in place?
It's a great question, and ordinarily my advice would be, and I'm not a lobbyist by trade or anything like that, but as we talked about earlier with respect to our socioeconomic programs, would be reach out to your member of Congress, and there's nothing wrong with doing that. Of course, you can do that here too, but given the way this process is playing out, I don't know that is going to have much of a way of an impact, at least right now. And in this case, the FAR 2.0 is not being written by Congress. That doesn't mean you couldn't reach out to Congress and say something like, hey, we'd love you to insert the rule of two above the simplified acquisition threshold in the statute. That would be nice, but that's not where the action is right now. So right now, the action is taking place on the regulatory level, not the congressional level. The FAR Council, that council I mentioned, comprised of representatives of the DOD, GSA, and NASA, is working with the OFPP, the Office of Federal Procurement Policy, which is an office within the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, and they're the ones who are engaged in this drafting. So right now, I would say those are the folks that need to be contacted. There should also be at some point opportunity for contractors to weigh in on at least some of these changes other than just sending an email to people you have no idea who they are, unelected officials in the FAR Council or the OFPP, when regulations are written or amended, there's a process that those regulations need to go through under what's called the Administrative Procedure Act. And so what that process ordinarily would call for in a situation like this is for the FAR Council to publish what's called a proposed rule. This rule would be, here's FAR 2.0, and here's everything we're doing, here's why we're doing it, and then there'd be an opportunity for the public to submit comments.
Yeah. So we'll put the links in a follow-up email and also in the podcast description to the FAR Council, OFPP, and the Administrative Procedures Act. We need to take a break. I'm talking to Stephen Koprince, educator, speaker, and author, whose mission is to explain federal government contracting principles and rules in plain English. When we come back, we'll talk about additional deregulations that could impact how small contractors compete for and win new contracts. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Shirley Collier, President and founder of Scale to Market, is your host for this GrowthMasters Federal presentation. Scale to Market helps businesses think, plan, collaborate, and build market value by developing and executing customized, data-driven business development playbooks, building efficient information systems, and creating high-performing BD teams. Utilizing the proprietary Davy Business Development Growth Framework, Scale to Market partners with business owners and executives to increase their company's value by achieving profitable and sustainable growth in the federal marketplace. Email Shirley at scollier@scaletomarket.com to learn more about the Davy Growth Framework and how it can be instrumental in helping grow your federal contracting business. Back now to Shirley's conversation with Steve Koprince as they discuss the changing federal marketplace for small contractors.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were discussing FAR 2.0 and specifically the potential elimination of the Rule of Two. The administration recently announced that it is looking for input from the public regarding regulations to potentially eliminate. Specifically, the administration is seeking suggestions about regulations that are harmful to business or unnecessary. So, Steve, in your opinion, are there regulations in the government contracts sphere that you would recommend be eliminated or altered in this initiative?
Yeah, great question. As you know, deregulation is a major theme in this administration. It's been pretty clear. I think with respect to the FAR and the FAR supplements, FAR 2.0 will likely accomplish much of the deregulation in the government contracting space. But it is important to remember the FAR isn't the only source of rules that apply to contractors, specifically small business contractors. So I would focus on the SBA's rules. As far as I can tell from the executive order, those rules are not included in FAR 2.0 rewrite. Those are contained in 13 CFR. It's Title 13 of the Code of Federal Regulations. That's outside the FAR, which is Title 48 of the Code of Federal Regulations. So just a couple that I would point to. I would first eliminate the SBA's 2-year rule for joint ventures. That's the rule that says that a joint venture can, once it wins its first contract, can only submit bids for up to 2 years, and then the parties have to go back and establish a new joint venture if they want to keep doing work together. I would also look at, with respect to joint ventures, again, whether to significantly reduce the requirements to have a compliant joint venture agreement. Those of your listeners who've ever tried to form a joint venture under the SBA rules know you have a requirement under the regulations to adopt a joint venture agreement that contains anywhere from 12 to 16 mandatory provisions, depending on how you look at kind of these sub-provisions. Missing even one of those provisions can cause the company to be ineligible. I think it's a case of over-regulation. I think we could reduce those requirements to maybe 3 or 4, maybe not the 12 to 16.
Good. We will put also a link in the follow-up email in the podcast description to the SBA rules contained in 13 CFR as well. Steve, as you mentioned, the FAR Council has been responsible for managing the FAR. Many attempts have been made to streamline federal procurement in the past, but with limited success. Do you think that this time will be successful, and how long will it take to actually implement the recommended changes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if we're talking about success here, it probably depends a bit in how you define it. If success is reducing the number of regulations, then yeah, I'm certain that FAR 2.0 is going to be significantly shorter and contain fewer regulations, probably far fewer than the current version of the FAR, just based on the factors that we talked about. For me, though, I would define success not just as deregulating, although there's value in looking at every regulation, but it's really improving the procurement ecosystem, making it more user-friendly, more receptive to small businesses, more receptive to new entrants, whether they're large or small, less ramp-up time, but still while preserving fairness and transparency, because those are longstanding hallmarks of what the FAR is intended. And we can debate whether it's been successful or not, but what it's intended to do in large part is preserve fairness and transparency in the process. So that's where the wait and see comes in. It's not just a matter of, did we cut out a bunch of stuff? To me, it's not. I'm sure that we're going to be able to do that, but can we do it in a way that is beneficial to contractors, especially small businesses, and maintains fairness and transparency in the federal market?
I agree, Steve. And I would add that just rewriting the rules doesn't mean that those rules will be immediately understood by the government's 35,000 contracting officers, and that very complex operating procedures and software will be immediately changed. I saw a graphic once published in Contract Management magazine that showed that there are over 110 individuals in the government that touch a typical $1 million federal acquisition. It includes not only contracting officials, but pricing people, legal, etc. They each play a role to ensure that the public's money is being spent wisely, fairly, and competitively, and I would imagine that all of those roles will probably need to be redefined. Therefore, my guess is that we may not see significant changes behind the scenes until FY27, which is only about 18 months from now. But in the interim, it will behoove all federal contractors to read and understand FAR 2.0 because those will be the new rules of the road. I am recommending that my clients update their strategic business development plans and processes to incorporate these new rules when they come out. So, in summary, the SBA socioeconomic certification programs are codified in law. Any efforts to eliminate or reduce the contracting goals must be approved by Congress. Reach out to your elected officials to express your support for these programs. In the FY25 budget, an estimated $149 billion must be spent with small businesses and $32 billion with small disadvantaged businesses. My recommendation is to ramp up your business development efforts. This is not the time to hunker down. Your competitors are not. The FAR and all of its supplements are being reviewed to eliminate any regulations that are not statutory. The rule of two is in jeopardy above the SAT simplified acquisition threshold, which is $250,000. The public will have an opportunity to comment, we think, but we also suggest that you reach out to the FAR Council and the OFPP. But the good news is that the intention of deregulation is to pave a path for more rapid, innovative procurement processes that encourage more competition and reduce the acquisition cycle. In my opinion, small businesses are uniquely positioned to provide innovative ideas, processes, and technologies in a timely manner if the government is willing to take risks and try new things, which it has generally been reluctant to do in the past. So as we wrap up here, Steve, do you have any final thoughts for our audience?
Well, first things first, thank you again so much for having me. It's been a wonderful discussion. I think as is clear from what we've talked about here today, 2025 is going to be truly a major year of changes in federal contracting. It already has been in many respects with some of these executive orders we're seeing, among other things, and I think FAR 2.0 is just going to turbocharge the change. So, my experience is that companies that are nimble, they're on top of these changes, they're keeping an eye on what's going on, and not hunkering down, as you said, but are going out there and taking advantage of the marketplace, understanding the changes and how to best take advantage of them, they're going to be the ones best positioned to succeed in this rapidly changing environment.
I agree. And Steve, thank you so much for joining me today and sharing your immense knowledge with our audience. Folks, if you would like to get in touch with Steve, he can be reached at coprinslaw@gmail.com or through LinkedIn. Or you can reach out to us here at Skelton Market and we'll make sure you're connected. This is Shirley Collier, President of Skelton Market and host of the Growth Masters Federal Podcast, signing off for now. As we close, I want to thank you for joining us today and encourage you to connect with me on LinkedIn and visit our website. That's skeltonmarket.com with the number 2 in the middle, where you will find a link to our webcast, which now include open captioning for those seeking more clarity in the narrative, along with our podcast, white papers, my blog, and other links and resources. While there, please leave us a comment or suggestion so we can stay focused on what's important to you. We'll see you next time.